Dobry utro, Tuberovsky. So let's do this. Let's examine the question that is underlying so much of not just libertarian philosophy, but also mainstream political science, that democracy and property are two sides of the same coin. Rather than say this is pure counterfeit, I will tell you that this is possible. Firstly, let's define what property is. And by property, we mean in this society private property, whether owned by individual living persons or juridic persons like corporations. Then there are, of course, other forms of property like communal property, tribal property, state property. But for all intents and purposes, when we say property and when libertarians say property, they are using the term to mean private property by individual or juridic persons. Okay, so as I stated, democracy and property are not necessarily opposite poles if this property, this private property, is more or less equitably distributed in a society. But as property ratios between richest and poorest widen, so does the democracy ratio, until there can be only the pretense of democracy. And all power is in the hands of those who own the property. I will also say that if the USSR was a false socialism, because all effective power was in the hands of the party bureaucracy and not the working class, and the USA is most surely a false democracy, as effective power is concentrated in private hands behind the backs of the citizen public, the same hands that have concentrated the ownership of society's resources, production, and distribution. This is the hidden hand of the market in reality, an oligarchy, a thief picking the public pocket. Perhaps one reason there is such a well-funded campaign against Sharia law in the West is because of Islam's punishment for theft, amputating the thieving hand, but I digress. The model for democracy in the U.S. and the West in general is so-called middle-class democracy, and that is based on private ownership of property. It's associated with the rise and spread of that class, the distribution of the form of private property, standing very roughly between the high and mighty and the desperate and the destitute. For this model to work at all, there needs to be a real living demographic basis for it. There needs to be an economic basis in the widest possible distribution of private property. When there is no such basis, demographically or economically, it cannot work, even in the stunted, truncated form in which it limps along in the West. Let's look at two historical examples. One is Russia, which I've belabored before. When Tsar Nicholas I abdicated under pressure from the streets, very much like what we saw in Cairo earlier this year, the middle-class politicians saw their chance to at last create the middle-class parliamentary voting democracy of their dream. So what went wrong? Why did it fuck up? Well, Russia had no mass middle class. There was no equitable distribution of property. 70% and plus of the population were pre-industrial, third-world peasants whose politics revolved around land and bread. The cities were dominated by an increasingly hungry industrial and service working class. The soldiers on whom the defense of this new democracy depended were mostly drawn from these sectors. And 50% of the population was not even Russian, and were regarded as second-class subjects. Democracy meant more to this great majority than just abstract rights and a ballot place. It meant a redistribution of social power, political and economic. This was unacceptable to the so-called democratic rulers of the new Russia, who were determined to impose the middle-class utopia on their society, even without a middle class. They rationalized this by their cant phrase that Russia isn't ready for democracy, by which they meant their own self-serving class interpretation of democracy. This interpretation was given the lie by the explosion of grassroots, self-governing bodies all over the former empire: Soviets, cooperatives, factory committees, land committees, soldiers' committees. The ironic thing is that the people in the Russian Revolution were at first willing to give these middle-class politicians the benefit of the doubt. But it soon became apparent that these politicians had no use for the democratic fundamentals of the revolution: land, bread, and peace. They were all just rhetorical hot air. This different interpretation of democracy by the lower orders was in turn a threat to the property classes and their hot air, and the Russian Democrats solved this dilemma by refusing to meet the popular demands even halfway, or to hold elections, the alleged reason for being of their entire philosophy, and relying instead on the old empire's officer corps and bureaucrats, as well as subsidy from the Western Allies, all the while accusing Lenin of taking German gold, and relying, of course, on even more hot air. It was no wonder that the mass of people grew as contemptuous of these so-called gas-bag Democrats, as these alleged gas-bag Democrats secretly feared and despised the mass majority. No wonder why either that this majority turned from them to follow other leaders with other visions. And if these leaders also betrayed their believers, they at least created an economic structure closer to the masses whom they governed. By tying political democracy to private property, which most people did not have, the so-called Russian Democrats of 1917 ensured the destruction of both. A second example is Cuba. Here, a pseudo-democratic republic had been implanted at the turn of the 20th century by U.S. occupation forces, as in Iraq a century later, and like Iraq, there was a proviso, the so-called Platt Amendment, that gave the U.S. the right to intervene at its discretion if things did not go right, that is, as the U.S. decided. That amendment was rescinded in 1934 as an act of Franklin D. Roosevelt's good neighbor policy, one of the few times the U.S. ever did act like such south of its borders. But the Cuban Republic's root defect was its basis on an urban middle class, which did exist, but was small in numbers and concentrated mostly in Havana. The rest of the country was poor, rural, many of its people still functionally illiterate, and treated like an internal colony to serve the concentration of wealth and property in the capital. Thus, it's no surprise that Cuba's democratic politics was, for 60 years, a shell game between which set of grafters could pick the treasury the cleanest, sell the most influence, and buy the most votes, and take the most money from the U.S. Embassy. Cuba also had a succession of dictators, Gerardo Machado in the 1920s, Fulgencio Batista in the 1950s, and Fidel Castro for the second half of the Cuban Republic's existence. Their idea of honest government was to close down the Cuban Congress as a menace to public health, and there was enough truth in this so that at the time of these coups, the average Cuban just shrugged in apathy when a democracy ever worked for him. So when Fidel and company took over the Cuban Republic, they knew that to justify their actions, they could not go back to business as usual. This time, as Fidel Castro said from day one, the revolution would be real. Now you can say that was a good thing or a bad thing, but it was indeed a real thing. There was no pretense in Castro's revolutionary actions, as there had been throughout the history of pre-revolutionary Cuba. Did the old Cuban Republic do some good things that the successor regime neglects to acknowledge? To be sure, mostly for those who could afford it. Cuba had the freest press in Latin America, in a country where many couldn't read and many more couldn't afford to buy books and newspapers. By the same token, it had fine national and private universities for the few who could afford sending their children to them. It had some of the finest hospitals in Latin America, where children died by the thousands yearly from hookworm, malaria, and common childhood diseases because there were no hospitals where they lived, because there was no profit in providing them. Is it any wonder that the mass of Cubans would follow Fidel as he destroyed what was left of Cuba's old democratic institutions and civil society? I want to show here a photograph from Bernardo Benesh's Secret Missions in Cuba, or Secret Missions to Cuba, for those of you out there who are fanatics about copyright infringement. I thought I had this marked, but apparently not. Here we go. Here we see the young Bernardo Benesh receiving the 1959 Havana Bar Association Award and a handshake from El Líder Máximo himself. This picture says it all as to why American-style democracy and the revolution could not keep that handshake. A luxurious professional setting of professional men in professional attire, as you can see, all firm believers in the rule of law, no doubt, and all the civic virtues of a democratic republic, with Fidel, although a former lawyer himself, looking totally out of place in his gorilla beard and fatigues. But these men themselves would soon have no place in Fidel's new order that he was just beginning to construct, just as the social revolution and the masses of people supporting it had no place in the property holders' version of democracy these men represented. Okay? Well, Azov, doesn't that prove the whole point? That democracy and property are perfect bedfellows, that just as these men stood for democracy, Fidel the dictator had to destroy them for that very reason. Well, just as you can take Cuban tobacco seeds and try growing them in Nicaragua and come out with an inferior grade in spite of your best efforts, democracy is also not exportable. It must be grown in home soil for it to be meaningful to the people it serves. Middle-class Western democracy did not take in Cuba did not take in Russia and is bound to fail in societies without the proper demographic basis, not because of the failure of the people, but because of the model's inappropriateness to the soil in which it's planted. If post-Soviet Russian oligarchs and mafiosi only get from Western democracy the right to steal from their partners, the state and the public, who can blame them in a land producing Enron and Goldman Sachs and Bernie Madoff? The Russian oligarchs are at least honest enough to see through the heavy layer of moralizing bullshit and digging out the real gold buried under Western-style democracy. And as we see democratic movements emerging in the Middle East, we also see no end of Western advisors on hand, ready to guide them on the path of the one true faith as preached by Western political missionaries, rather than see these fledgling converts experience the light on terms relevant to them. There will be no doubt many problems these societies will have to overcome, and they may not ever do so. But one sure recipe for political incontinence is to swallow whole the ideological castor oil peddled by the Western jihadists. Because these warnings and lessons do apply to us, just as much to those so-called backward people who allegedly don't get it. In fact, not having something is not nearly as tragic or so reprehensible as claiming to possess something you don't, comparable to filing a false insurance claim. Because as wealth concentrates upward for the few, just as surely do poverty and powerlessness expand downward for the many. Therefore, we are in as much moral danger in the U.S. and Europe of losing the demographic basis of what democracy we have. To date, this growing discrepancy hasn't cracked the political structure, but the seismic shift of raw economic power to the upper 1% of the population shows every sign of continuing and increasing as a cause and reflection of the current depression. It does not take too very long for a nation's body politic to follow the shape of its economy. With an eviscerated middle class, a powerless working class, who is there left to manage public affairs? Well, there are many folks out there on the right, so-called libertarians, who will agree with First Chief Justice of the United States, John Jay, who put it thusly: those who own the country ought to govern it. The current U.S. Supreme Court seems hell-bent on restoring this fine tradition of oligarchy. Uh-oh. We know what that means. Hello? Milton Friedman. You're upset at this new video? Why? Because I'm unfair to former Cuban President Batista. You remembered his days very well, I'm sure. What's that? Do what? Let me change ears. I neglected to mention all the great opportunities for enrichment that flourished under his hand. Well, it's true the mafia had it as good there as they do in Russia now, with heroin and casinos and prostitution and real estate scams. But doesn't this prove my point that democracy in such a setting is doomed to fail if the property classes can see no profit in it? I'm forgetting. Wherever there's private profit, that is democracy.